I think that just as we're living in a nuclear age, we have grown so tremendously in scientific knowledge, it doesn't seem too much to say that men can begin to awaken to the fact that they haven't grown enough spiritually and haven't recognized their spiritual capacities.
Once something like eating is death, then you've struck at the very heart of life. The enemy of the older radical theories may have been the ruling class, but today the stakes of whether we will reform ourselves into a new kind of human being, a new kind of society, whether we will find selves worth being, the stakes of it are simply life itself.
As modernity has created promises that it has no ability to keep. What this means is that we're a society of disembedded individuals, stuck in the impossible situation of being alone together. And what was understood as emancipation has proved to be a form of isolation. It is important to understand that what I am telling you is not simply a cultural history. It's a description of the story that shapes every single person that you know. This is why there is a rise in mental illness. It's absolutely concurrent with the disembedding of the individual, because individuals can't constitute themselves by the very nature of the case. Subjectivity cannot sustain its own weight. We need others to tell us. But we've been given an ethical mandate by the Enlightenment that tells us that that's immoral, that nobody should constrain us.
All right. Well, we are back for another episode of Dustbowl Diatribes. And for this episode, we're happy to bring you an interview with Dr. Larry Chapp. So why don't you tell us about who you are and what you're about?
All right, very quickly. I'm a Midwestern boy, originally from Lincoln, Nebraska, and grew up in a typical sort of suburban, existence, very middle class, very American. I'm 64, so my formative years were the 60s and the 70s, the crazy time after the council and all of that. And I was an intellectual and nerdy little kid, very bookish, always have been, oriented towards ideas and so on. So I eventually, I spent a lot of time not caring about religion very much, which is typical of kids and adolescents. But eventually I began reading theology and philosophy and things like that. I decided that I wanted to go to the seminary. I'm a cradle Catholic, and thought, well, maybe the priesthood's for me. And I spent many years in the seminary, got degrees in philosophy and theology, but then discerned that the priesthood was not for me. And I went on to get a PhD in theology from Fordham University, which I got in 1994. I am married, have one kid. And at 94, I got a job at a place called DeSales University, a small, tiny little Catholic college near Allentown, Pennsylvania. And I, as you do as a young scholar, you think, well, eventually I'm going to be running PhDs at places like Notre Dame and stuff like that. So I viewed DeSales as simply a kind of stepping stone job. But I loved it. And I taught primarily just undergraduates. Occasionally, I would adjunct a graduate course here and there at other institutions. But primarily, I taught undergraduates, those 18 to 22-year-olds. And I absolutely loved it, ended up staying 20 years. But then around 2013, my wife and I and a former student named John Gribowich, who is now a priest, Father John Gribowich, decided that we wanted to live a more radical life. We had always loved Dorothy Day and Peter Maurin and the Catholic Worker Movement. I had taught classes on it. But after a while, I started to feel a little bit uneasy, a little bit like a hypocrite, because the more you read Dorothy Day and Peter Maurin, the more you realize their insistence on living the Sermon on the Mount and the call to holiness and to live your Catholic faith in very radical ways. And my life as a professor was just very cushy. I had all the perks of the professorate, trips to Rome all the time. I love Rome. It's my favorite city. And I just started feeling, though, and my wife and John Gribowich, too, we need something more radical. So we decided to start a Catholic worker farm. And we bought a very small piece of land, about 11 acres, northwest of Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, which is in northeastern Pennsylvania, in the mountains. And we've been there since 2013. And the main mission of the farm is very similar to that laid out by Dorothy Day's co-founder of the movement, Peter Maurin. He was the great sort of founder of the Catholic Worker Farm. And his notion of what he called the agronomic university, and that the goal of the farms isn't so much to simply grow food and raise animals to give away to the poor, which we do, but also to serve as simply a kind of agrarian sort of think tank where people can, and spiritual center. My wife and I are both Benedictine oblates. We have a small chapel, an icon chapel with the Eucharist on our property. And we get, and our main mission seems to be lately to have morphed into hosting visitors who are interested in knowing more about Dorothy Day and Peter Maurin, and in a sense, what you might want to call these days, the Catholic back to the land sort of movement. And they come and we pray the Liturgy of the Hours. If they bring a priest, we have mass. And then we do a little farm work, milk some dairy goats, collect eggs from the chickens, fix a fence line, play around with the sheep and feed the sheep, that kind of thing. We have sheep. And but mainly we just sit around and then we discuss faith, big ideas, Catholicism, what Peter Maurin called roundtable discussions. And we do a lot of that. And so that's kind of become education in the way of the land and the spirituality of the land in a Catholic register is sort of become our main mission. And so about 3 years ago, I decided at the behest of many people and contrary to my wishes to start a blog called Gaudium at Spes22.com. Gaudium at Spes is a document from the Second Vatican Council. Chapter 22 is about how you can only understand humanity through the lens of Christ. Christ, in a sense, reveals to human beings what a human being really is. And that was a central text for John Paul II and other people like him at the council. And so I chose that as the title of the blog. And I thought that the blog would amount to virtually nothing. And I really dislike blogs. And yet it took off. It kind of went viral. And then now I do YouTube videos on it and so on. And so I see that as an extension of my Catholic worker ministry as well. So that's who I am. And here I am.
Could you explain, so you talked about you had your education, you had your career, and then you went to the Catholic worker. Could you explain your involvement in like Communio, ressourcement, von Balthasar, and how that fits in?
As a young man you have to go back. As a young man in seminary, I was being taught in my undergraduate seminary and my philosophy degree what in Catholic circles and academic circles we call neo-scholastic philosophy. It's essentially philosophy rooted in the ideas of St. Thomas Aquinas, Thomistic philosophy, but then an entire tradition of thought that emerged from that. And by the 20th century, it had morphed into a very arid and dry and rationalistic enterprise. And I was learning it there, and I was very dissatisfied with it. It seemed lifeless. It seemed desiccated. It seemed devoid of the verve and the punch of the gospel. And then a wise spiritual director I had there, Father Anton Morgenroth, a convert from Judaism who had fled Germany during the war years, turned me on to certain thinkers that have gotten the name ressourcement, which is a French word that means return to the sources. And these were 20th century Catholic theologians, and Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict would have been one of them, who wanted to not repudiate Aquinas. They wanted to continue to use Aquinas, but to deepen Catholic theology by broadening our understanding of the tradition, by going back to the sources, Scripture and the Church Fathers, so that you read Aquinas now. You don't read Scripture and the Church Fathers through the lens of Aquinas, but the other way around. So Aquinas simply becomes one moment in the tradition, a very important moment in the tradition, but just one. And so ressourcement to me was a great revelation. And the ressourcement writers do not write in that rationalistic, arid, desiccated way. Their writings were poetic, symbolic, lyrical almost, and almost contemplative and meditative, a kind of return to a sort of monastic approach to theology rather than an academic university approach, although they were academic works. And I did my doctoral dissertation eventually on one of those ressourcement thinkers, a man named Hans Urs von Balthasar, who was a Swiss Catholic theologian, a very good friend of Joseph Ratzinger's. And another theologian, Henry de Lubac, a French Jesuit, was in that school. And after the Second Vatican Council, de Lubac, Balthasar, and Ratzinger, and a few others, started the journal in the early 70s called Communio, International Catholic Review. And it has various international versions. So there's a Polish Communio, an Italian Communio, a French Communio, a German Communio, and a North American Communio. And when I started my job at DeSales in 1994, I ran a conference on the theology of Hans von Balthasar. I got a grant for it. And I invited to that conference folks from the Washington, D.C. offices of the North American version of Communio. David L. Schindler, who just passed away, in particular, came and gave a keynote address. And that was my introduction to the folks at the North American Communio. And from that point forward, I became deeply involved in the Communio ressourcement project. And to characterize ressourcement theology, it's neither liberal nor conservative. It's not progressive in that sort of typical sense of progressive, and it's not conservative in that neocon kind of way. And Dorothy Day was a big devotee, a big fan of ressourcement theology, because what she saw in it was what I saw in it, is that by actually returning to the Christological sources of our faith, Scripture and the Church Fathers and so on, you actually end up with a kind of theology that has the potential, at least, to be far more subversive and far more radical towards the social order in which we live than any other version, in my opinion, of Catholic theology. And hence, that is why I had that dual commitment to both Communio theology and the Catholic worker movement and Dorothy Day's vision, because I am of the opinion that modern Western culture is dominated by capitalism, mammon, money, militarism, the surveillance state, the national security state, a lack of concern for the spiritual dimension of human existence, a largely materialistic understanding of life. And I became very critical of those elements of American culture. And I saw in Communio theology a very subversive element towards it. In fact, David L. Schindler, who just passed away, was a deep critic of America. I mean, he was a patriot. He loved his country, but a deep critic of the essentially unchristian ethos of American militarism, capitalism, and so on. And so that's my involvement in the Communio project. It's subversive.
Mm-hmm. And would you, not to get caught up in something you're not, or maybe polemics, why do you think a neo-scholastic or neo-Thomistic theory isn't as effective at confronting the contradictions of modernity?
Well, it can be. It's just, it's usually not. Usually what neo-scholasticism is, it's a very, in some ways, the way it had taken shape in the 20th century. I think Thomas Aquinas, by the way, can be very subversive. But neo-scholasticism had become largely a defensive theological movement, a circle the wagons, fortress Catholicism kind of movement. So neo-scholasticism was opposed to certain elements of American culture, but it tended to oppose very abstract things like moral relativism, the sexual ethic of modernity, and so on, but kind of just sort of accepted the fundamental political, social, economic categories of modern life. They were more concerned with apologetics, more concerned with proving Catholic dogmas vis-a-vis Protestant critiques in particular. And the kind of neo-scholasticism that emerged after the Protestant Reformation, that then became dominant in the 20th century, really was kind of obsessed with proving Catholic dogma in this apologetic way. Now, that has its values. I'm not here to disparage it completely, but I think it's an exercise in missing the point. You can, in a sense, deductively show the veracity of various Catholic doctrines, and yet not make them attractive, not make them cogent, not give them punch, not give them the charisma of the gospel, and thus to miss the cultural crisis that is at hand. I have a book coming out from Ignatius Press next spring called Confessions of a Catholic Worker. And it is essentially, I'm making the point that, and this goes to your question, I'm making the point that given the nature of our modern culture in the West, it is and the death, in a sense, of cultural Catholicism, it is no longer possible to simply stand where you are, to embrace the status quo, and then put sort of Jesus sprinkles on the secular ice cream. That's as we see with the church hemorrhaging young people today. there is no standing still. There's no stasis. You're either moving towards Christ or you're abandoning Christ in the way things are now. So in my book, I argue we face a crisis of a decisional crisis. Ratzinger makes this point. Balthasar makes this point. Others have made this point. Other Catholic critics, that Catholicism has to become evangelical, mystical, and deeply radical in many ways, or it's going to perish as an effective thing. And I think neo-scholasticism did not understand that. I don't think they got the depth of the cultural crisis that we face as Christians in the modern world.
And isn't that the term that comes to mind is Whig Thomism?
Thank you. Yes, thank you. You know that term. That's great. That's fantastic. Yes, Whig Thomism. There was a movement really that really got steam in the United States in the 1980s called Catholic neoconservatism, or neocons for short, led by the journal First Things and Father Richard Newhouse and people like George Weigel. I know George, he's a friend, and I like George, and I liked Father Newhouse. But in many ways, I think the whole neocon project, Whig Thomism, was an attempt to show that America in its constitutional order is essentially a crypto-Catholic country. This goes back to the book by John Courtney Murray in the early 60s called We Hold These Truths, in which he said, hey, look, our Constitution is not rooted in the French Enlightenment, but the British Enlightenment. And it's rooted, therefore, in British common law, which is itself eventually rooted in St. Thomas Aquinas and medieval theories of common law. And therefore, Murray argued, and the neocons argue, America is essentially a Catholic project. We just don't know it. We don't call it that. And the role, therefore, of the Catholic Church isn't to challenge and to subvert the social order, the ordo of American imperialism, but to bless it and to tease out of it all of its Catholic greatness. And I think that's an extremely wrong-headed project in very fundamental ways.
Right. And I think I can speak for Laurie. We agree with you. And one of the things that keeps me awake at night is how can smart people, without doing a whole lot of like apologies and a lot of work to synthesize, how can you think you can cram together Whig and Thomism and make that work?
Yeah, it's essentially a deeply conservative vision politically, and then what happens is that this conservative political vision, I like to use the image that the neocon tail wags the Thomistic dog, which means that Aquinas is then pressed into service to buttress the American project. And in order to do that, you have to lop off huge sections of what Thomas spoke about. Mm-hmm. And you're ignoring large parts of the Thomistic achievement. And that's why I said earlier, if you read Thomas correctly, he can be quite subversive in his own way. And I don't think the neocons understood. Yeah, you're right. The attempt to turn Thomas into a kind of Burkean conservative, or a sort of a British Whig.
Liberal. Yeah.
Yeah. And therefore, big L liberal is insane. I mean, I'm just going to call it that. It's wrong-headed from the bottom up. And it's a completely incoherent way of reading Aquinas, in my opinion.
Yeah, I would say it's a whole like scholarly industry too.
Yeah.
Laurie's a Straussian, and she kind of came out of an adjacent field.
Yeah.
Laurie's what?
A Straussian.
Oh, Straussian.
Trained a Straussian. Yeah.
My dear friend, Dr. Rodney Hauser, is a big Straussian guy too.
Well, it's a good foundation for sure. And it melts fairly easily with a certain strain of Catholic political thought. I wanted to back up a little bit and just because you mentioned some of the things are kind of wrong with the world in your estimation. I'll just sum it up as liberalism and capitalism and kind of like the destruction that's caused to family, society, the environment, everything. How does ressourcement theology and the Catholic worker movement address those problems? Can you give us linkage?
Well, and let's go back to Dorothy Day. Dorothy, of course, was very smitten with ressourcement thinkers, and she was introduced to them by Peter Maurin. But also Dorothy was very, and this is true of ressourcement as well. I should back up a bit. One of the other things that ressourcement stood for wasn't just retrieving the church fathers and the scriptures, but placing the broader Catholic tradition in dialogue with modern philosophy and modern ideas. Okay, and you reject some of those ideas, but spoils of Egypt. There are things in modern philosophy that Thomas never really developed. And one of those would be phenomenology. John Paul II incorporated certain phenomenological insights into his fundamental Thomism, and Lublin Thomism it's called, but also personalism. Dorothy Day was a big fan of personalist philosophy, guys like Emmanuel Mounier and others. And the essence of personalism is that you have to begin philosophy, which then builds into theology, by recognizing the true contours of the human person and the human subjectivity. And one of the problems with liberalism that then Dorothy critiques and ressourcement critiques and personalism critiques is its anthropology, is its fundamentally individualistic vision of what a human being is, that we are like these isolated monads of freedom. And that's the substrate. That's the beginning point. We're like a tabula rasa of freedom. And then the world presents itself to us as a variety of choices that the imperial self, the therapeutic self, then incorporates into itself. And if you then choose to add certain relational elements to that, your relationships with other people, that's fine. But it's essentially still a very individualistic and self-referential understanding of the human being. And that then spills over, if you are a Christian and you accept that mentality, it kind of spills over then into your theology of God as well. God becomes also this sort of impenetrable, homogeneous thing that stands over against us. And so what ressourcement guys wanted to do and what Dorothy wanted to do was to deepen our understanding of who God is, and thereby deepen our understanding of the relational nature of the human being. And that involved a development of Trinitarian theology, an understanding of Trinitarian theology of where God is an infinite series of relations, that the three persons in God are distinct persons from one another, but being infinite persons, they're capable of an infinite communion with one another, so infinite that it becomes a unity, a single God. Now that I'm speaking temporally here, that like things happen in sequence, but they didn't. So if God is essentially relational, he is a communion of persons. He created us to be relational. That is then the essence of human personhood. And this is Dorothy's vision. We are inherently relational creatures. And that's saying more than simply we are inherently social creatures, because you can develop a whole beehive mentality of human society if you just say we're social creatures. To say we're relational creatures on this deeply spiritual way means that you have to emphasize the communitarian aspects of our life and how we order ourselves politically and economically, those communitarian aspects of life. And you have to privilege those over the individualistic aspects of life. And I would say that was the revolution that Dorothy Day called for, which is why she was all about localism. It wasn't localism for the sake of localism. It was an emphasis on the local because that's where the personal happens. The personal doesn't happen on grand global scales. It doesn't happen in these abstract ways. It happens in the foundational constitutive relationships that we have with everybody in our local community. And so anyway, the communitarianism, localism, a relational vision of the human, a personological sort of theology that then stands in direct contrast to the hyper-individualism and materialism of American consumeristic capitalism.
So, and I totally agree with all of that. So like on the ground, what does that look like? In other words, is the aim, for instance, of Communio and Catholic Worker, as you see it, to influence the church, especially Communio, I suppose, to influence the church so that the church becomes something that can encourage this? Or is it more directly aiming at changing the culture apart from the church?
I think it's both at the same time. I don't think it's a case, as in Rod Dreher's Benedict option, of simply saying, well, first we need to, in a sense, establish these well-defined identities as Catholics in these healthy, vibrant sort of communities of faith. And then once we do that, then we have something to give to the broader world, and we can go out into the world. I like Rod. I think he's onto something, but I think that there's a problem with it. And the problem is that you in the modern world, there's no such thing as an enclave. There's no such thing as a fortress of solitude. And I know Rod knows that, but anyway, there's no fortress of solitude. We can't be like modern day Essenes running out to Qumran and stockpiling our hand grenades embossed with Our Lady of Fatima and buried school buses and stuff. I'm being facetious, but it's an image of an insular Catholicism. No, Dorothy was about both at the same time, and Communio as well. You build up the church precisely in and through engagement with the world, because Catholics live in this world. All right. And you can't simply say, well, let's develop these vibrant, intentional communities, and that will then give people the resources to go out into the world. Now, you have to do both at the same time, because you cannot my point is, you cannot in the modern world develop these vibrant localist communities in isolation from engagement with that world. Because people bring the questions of the world to those communities. And if you don't have answers to those questions and alternatives, to the kind of life that the world offers in constructive ways, then you're just going to fly. You're just going to become one more little isolated compound of faith. And that will eventually fail.
Yeah. And I guess one of the things that keeps me up at night is having been in like the organic farming scene and trying to be involved with some communities, even a Catholic worker here, is it would even the establishment of an intentional community that could be relatively independent already sounds utopian from everything I've encountered in life, because everybody's bringing so much baggage from like the liberalism, the individualism, the capitalism. And I agree with you that like we need to do both. We need to both be independent, be localistic, but be open to the world. But how do you feel like in practice? Do you have examples, or do you feel like you are successfully like passing that third way in between the enclaves and total openness?
David L. Schindler once said that success is not a gospel category. And we have to remember that Jesus' ministry ended on a cross, and he predicted for his followers the same. So I don't use a metric of a kind of success in a worldly sense of, how many people are we influencing? Have we changed anything in our local area and so on? That would be nice if those things happened, but
Sure.
that's not the main metric. The main metric is sanctity. The main metric is, are you creating Christ-like communities, and are you engendering in the people that you encounter in your concrete existence? Are you engendering Christ-like existence in those people by living it yourself? And I will then leave it up to the Holy Spirit. I will leave it up to God as to the extent to which that fire will catch and spread. In some ways, the moment has to be right. You can strike a match, but if you're trying to light wet wood, nothing will happen. The match that we're lighting has to also fall on combustibles, which means people have to be in a state of mind where they're ready to be ignited. And so one of the greatest challenges we face as Catholic workers is actually, and sort of ressourcement theologians, is to get people to see that they need this remedy. All too often, people are simply content with the American way of life, but then they don't understand why they're miserable. They don't understand why they're unhappy. They don't understand why their spiritual core seems so empty. And so they have to reach a point of existential decision on their own part for that Catholic worker match to fall into proper combustibles. In that regard, one of the problems that I do have with the use of the term intentional community, I use it, it's a convenient shorthand. We know what it means, simply a community of faith. But in some ways, true communities are not designed. They're not intentional in the sense of, let's get a group of people together that all think exactly like we think, and then let's start this big thing and see where it goes. Now, we do that to a certain extent, but and Dorothy makes this point, Real communities they flow organically. They don't have to be intentional. They flow organically out of the natural bonds of family, cult, religion, neighborhood, community, those sorts of things. And so I think what we're doing, both on our farm, but also in our parish, we attend what's called an Anglican ordinariate parish, which is Catholic, but it's a bunch of Anglican converts to Catholicism, and Pope Benedict allowed them to bring their Anglican liturgy in and so forth. Now, I'm a cradle Catholic, but my wife and I attend it simply because we think that this parish is simply, they're not thinking in terms of we're starting an intentional community. They're simply doing it. They're simply doing the faith. All right. So we have a home for unwed mothers, and we have a doctor in the parish that does things for free. And, we have various farms associated with the parish that grow things for people and so on. And none of this was planned. None of this was designed in advance. And so what we need are these kinds of little tiny successes to simply bubble up from below of their own volition. I don't think any sort of strategic plan or project where we say, here's what we need to do, X, Y, Z, is necessarily going to be successful.
Oh, I'd like to throw a little bit of a rock into that, but
Well, go right ahead.
Not
Yeah,
a big
absolutely.
one. I love what you're saying. I think you're right that a lot of times these things happen better spontaneously than if you try to design them, because the real, human bonds of people matter, and you can't just create them out of whole cloth. But I continue to wish that the church would encourage this, and so part of what I was asking last time was, is there a project, or should there be a project to influence the church to influence our culture in this direction? Because right now it primarily does not, right? You don't hear this. There's no program to sort of like reach out to people and say, this is a good idea. If you can do it, you should try to do it in any small way you can. There's really none of that, right? And even like the Catholic worker movement and the church are kind of at arm's length, even now that Dorothy's in the process of canonization. And so would you like to see that? I mean, this is something
yes.
I keep coming back to.
That's not a rock thrown at all. I actually completely agree with that, and I'm not making myself probably very clear when I criticize the use of the word intentional communities. I just kind of what I'm criticizing is ideology and abstraction. Mm-hmm. And the like our own example on the farm is a perfect example. I mean, when we started the farm, we had all of these full-blown ideas born out of a kind of ideology. Here's what we're going to do, and this is what's going to happen, and this is the plan that we're going to put in place. And that's all well and good. We do that when we start things. But in very short order, we were disabused of most of our ideas, which failed and which didn't work, and which were shown to be wrongheaded. And so we had to allow the Spirit to move within us. We had to allow ourselves to learn to not be stubborn with our ideas and to grow in the missional direction that reality was imposing upon us. So that's kind of what I mean. But by all means, the bishops in particular need to get a better hold of the crisis that we face, and they need to be developing resources. Let's put it that way: pooling resources to aid and abet parishes and other small Catholic units to put into place these kinds of forms of living. And I would also think that it should begin as well with the bishops exercising their teaching role and to be more critical of American culture. And if the bishops were more critical of American culture and American politics and American militarism, those sorts of things, in very evangelical and powerful ways, I think that would trickle down without even any strategic plan or directives from the bishops themselves saying, we're going to set up a committee on Catholic worker communities or something like that, or intentional communities. No, the bishops just need to lead by example, by word and deed. And they're not doing that. So, for example, I once wrote a blog post on like America's nuclear deterrent. I think it's absolutely scandalous, almost blasphemous, that the bishops of the most powerful nation in the history of the world militarily, in possession of nuclear weapons of enormous magnitude, and whose official strategic policy is mutually assured destruction, which is a grossly immoral policy according to Catholic teaching. You do not target indiscriminately mass cities with mass destruction, and that's what our deterrent is all about. Okay. Oh yeah. Well, we would never really use them. Oh yeah. You know that for a fact. You would never. So the fact is, so for example, the bishops are really, really good in all the sexual morality stuff, so they'll torment some poor 15-year-old boy who has certain, self-gratification tendency, that's a grave mortal sin, blah, blah. But a Catholic 18-year-old that can sit in a nuclear silo, key ready to turn, there's no problem with that. That young man can go to sleep at night with the full calm of his conscience. And I think that's an enormous problem a huge blind spot. Had the American bishops 50, 60 years ago developed this very strong prophetic stand against the American nuclear deterrent and America's militaristic foreign policy, I think we'd see a very different Catholicism in the United States today. Very different, because that would then have a trickle effect across other missional elements of the American Catholic Church. It would set a tone. It would set a prophetic tone. And that's just one example. You could then move into the need for a stronger critique of America's neoliberal economic system. And the bishops, to their credit, do critique elements of that, and they're pro-immigration and pro-universal healthcare and all these sorts of things. But it doesn't come wedded to any sort of profound criticism of the foundations of America's economic theory and economic way of life. So those are just kind of two examples. But I agree with you. I mean, there has to be leadership from the bishops on a variety of fronts, and we're just not getting it.
And I guess this is partly, a project to get their attention and to try to shift the focus of the church towards these things. And I really appreciate that. I mean, it's such a tragedy to see these institutions and the church in particular as a universal global church with quite a bit of influence and resources not direct its attention to these things. So anything we can do to kind of make that happen, I'm all for.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there's no magic bullet. We're in a bit of a pickle. We're in a bad way culturally, and there's these involve prudential judgments that reasonable people can disagree about. But there are also some, in my opinion, non-negotiables that the church has dropped in the past. I'm all in favor of the church's sexual ethic. I'm no major revisionist in terms of sexual. I'm pretty traditional in my approach to sexual morality. Nevertheless, I have a huge problem with the fact that it seems to be front and center in most of the concerns that the bishops bring forward. That has to be downstream of a whole set of other criticisms to various Americanist commitments that just don't exist.
Mm-hmm. Well, so I have a theory that I think can be brought to bear on this, and tell me what you think if this explains it. So briefly to rephrase what you're laying out, sort of one manifestation of the Whig Thomism, if you will, that's still with us in Catholicism is we care very much about personal sanctity, sexual morality, especially.
Yes.
But we can be totally blind to the ways we are in like beyond grave mortal sin at a systematic and international level. So, like you said,
yes,
that
absolutely.
18-year-old.
Yeah. The emphasis on sexual morality and personal piety, these sorts of things are evidence of basically an accommodation with the liberal spirit of individualism, because
Right.
those are sins of private sins of the individual, in a sense, and not the deeply socially structured sins of American militarism and capitalism.
Mm-hmm. And yet those same bishops, they can still complain about, say, pornography and call it systematic structures of sin. but it's like there's a prudential judgment being made where we're going to worry about these things and not these things. And any attempt here's my devil's advocate defense of the bishops. Any attempt to change like the consensus around that, you're immediately going to get pulled into the cultural war riptide, where let's say you want to care more about the environment, or let's say you want to dismantle nukes and that whole system. Now the conservatives can say, oh, that's more like peacenik modernism. And the progressives can say, yes, of course, that's why we should all just vote Democrats. They won't say it quite that simply, but that seems to me to be the case. But do you agree?
Yeah, I do agree. I think that's one of the things that keeps the bishops silent on these matters, because they don't want to be perceived as involved in partisan politics. And yet they don't seem to have any concern with being perceived as involved in partisan politics when they are strongly pro-life on the abortion issue, which I support. I mean, I'm against abortion. So I think the bishops are right to be pro-life, obviously. And Dorothy Day was pretty dadgum traditional when it came to these things as well. So I'm not here to argue against those things. But nevertheless, like I said, the bishops don't seem to be too concerned to be tagged with the Catholic Church is simply the Republican Party at prayer when it puts all of its eggs in the pro-life basket, all the while ignoring nuclear weapons, the environment, and those kinds of things. And so I would say, well, if you, one way to avoid being seen as partisan politically is to make sure you pay deep attention to that seamless garment of life ethic, and you weigh things carefully in that calculus, and you act accordingly. And if you act consistently, that's the key. If you act consistently in that seamless garment of life ethic, and are not simply using the word seamless garment as a way of saying, well, let's just ignore abortion. Let's just ignore all the sexual stuff and let's focus on the social stuff. All right. Which it often is the case, which is why conservatives don't trust it. But it's absolutely true. If you look at the writings of John Paul II, he was a seamless garment of life ethicist. And he could be deeply critical of Western style consumerism and capitalism. For example, when the Soviet Union fell and Poland emerged out of communist domination, John Paul immediately started warning his fellow Poles, do not go down the path of Western style capitalist consumerism. Don't go down that path. And yet they did. And the results are here. So I would say, as long as the bishops maintain a consistent ethic and fight for these causes, then I think they will avoid being seen as either just the Democratic Party at prayer or the Republican Party at prayer.
And yet, as far as I can tell, at least in the short run, things are not going to change in terms of how bishops deal with the world and teach, govern.
It doesn't seem to be the case. The bishops right now are, and I guess understandably, they're obsessed with the sexual abuse crisis. And they're obsessed with the lack of priests, the sheer, put yourself in the position of your average bishop, and you've got, say, 120 parishes in your diocese and 48 priests. That focuses your attention very quickly on just sort of logistical staffing issues, brick and mortar issues. I mean, how many dioceses hold these synods now, not related to the current Vatican Synod, but just various synods. And eventually the synods just devolve into, okay, let's decide what parishes to close. All right. And out of the synod comes simply, okay, we're going to close the following 25 parishes and consolidate these and so on. These are all rearguard actions. These are all the actions of a church in decline. And somebody's got to manage that, right? Somebody's got to do that, but that's their obsession. That's their focus. Sex abuse crisis, the decline in numbers, the decline in priests, demographics, closing parishes, trying to maintain the school system and the parish status quo. They're treading water. All they're really doing right now is treading water and going under once in a while, rising up, spitting the water out, taking another deep breath and treading water some more. But what they really need to do is to realize, if you really want to reverse these trends, then you have to stop your focus on these penultimate issues of staffing and scandal. And you need to create a bigger picture. You need to create something provocative, something attractive again. And this kind of what Bishop Barron calls beige Catholicism, this status quo Catholicism, it's not attractive. And we're going to continue then to be focused on these sorts of issues related to downsizing, more than we are on prophetically proclaiming the gospel to our culture.
Do we need to have, ironically, maybe a more top-down approach? Because I've always wondered, I'm a convert, okay, but I've been a Catholic for, I don't know, 20 years or so. And, one of the reasons I joined is because I came to realize as first a Presbyterian and then a Lutheran that, there's a lot of like political opinions and arguments, and Christians almost always end up asserting their politics instead of anything else. And I like the fact that even if I disagreed with the church teaching at a certain point, there was a teaching and there was a source of authority. It wasn't just some sort of democratic vote that we were all going to duke it out in the process. But yet, is there enough leadership, I guess? In other words, is there kind of like a disconnect between, because this is how I sense it anyway, that there's a disconnect between the papacy and what it actually teaches and represents, and the bishops and the clergy, right? To the point where I can hear what Pope Francis says, or Pope Benedict before him, and Pope John Paul, and I can say, this is really good. This could inform my worldview. This could change things. And then I don't hear any of that in the church that I go to. And so what is that? Like, why is there not more of the Catholic, authority in a way, asserting control to make this happen? I don't know. We're dealing with humans.
No, I agree with you. I'm not a great devotee of this notion that the church's problems are going to be solved by sort of decentralization and synodality and a more democratic openness to things. I mean, Protestant churches already have that, and they're in an even steeper decline in many ways, mainline Protestants anyway, than the Catholic Church is. More democratic, synodal, decentralized structures are not in and of themselves a magic bullet. I keep using that phrase, but they're not a magic bullet to solving the problems either. I like to go back to a favorite phrase of mine, which is that personnel is policy. You can have all of the proper structures you want, but unless you have the right people in place, then it's going to amount to nothing. So what we have is therefore a crisis. We have a crisis in the laity who remained largely informed by the dominant, say, American culture. But they're not being roused out of that, because we also have a crisis of leadership in the church. And so you're right. I mean, the Pope might say certain wonderful things, and even individual bishops here might say wonderful things, but it remains disconnected because there's no leadership behind it. There is no concerted effort to make sure, for example, that priests are trained properly in all of this stuff. I think one of the primary problems is that priests are trained theologically, but in very sort of boilerplate ways. And then they get out into a parish and then they become consumed with, I need to re-blacktop the parking lot. I need to refurbish the bathrooms in the parish hall. Oh my God, we're $20,000 in the red this past month. I need to hold a Monte Carlo night fundraiser. These are the kinds of things that pastors then get consumed with, and they don't have the time to read. They don't have many priests don't read anything that the Pope has said, or that the USCCB has put out, or even decent theology books, or they're too busy to do any of that. So the homilies become these bromide-filled sort of anodyne things. I call them, homilies that say it's nice to be nice to the nice. Sort of let us homilies. Let us now go forth and be kind to our neighbors. And this, I got that from my first grade teacher. I don't need to go to church to hear that. Lunchline etiquette taught me those things when I was in first grade. I need to hear something more substantive out of that pulpit. We need, in a lot of ways, I think this is key. We need a rejuvenation, a revolution in homiletics, because for better or for worse, those 10 to 15 minutes on a Sunday are the only exposure the average Catholic in the pew is going to have to Catholic theology, Catholic ideas. And so it's the only real Catholic instruction they're getting in a week. Everything else is secular. And if then when they go to church, that 15-minute homily or even 10-minute homily is just filled with beige, boring stuff, then no, the ecclesial needle is not going to be moved. This is just a fancy way of saying we need inspiring priests. And that means we need priests that are deeply immersed in the spiritual life, in the intellectual life. But where do you find such men when you have a shortage of priests? Where do you find such men? But I think it's imperative that the bishops cultivate such men. And therefore, we have to take a very careful look, I think, at seminary formation and ongoing priestly formation to make sure that our priests are galvanized to confront the culture and to inspire the people in the pews. Because I think, and I'm on a bit of a rant here now, I think most lay people are ready to be led in this direction. I think most lay people are thirsty for this kind of leadership. And when you have a dynamic, well-formed, intellectually vibrant, spiritually vibrant priest in a parish, you see that parish come alive. All of it. You want to know the difference between a successful parish and a boring parish? Look at the priest that's running it. And this is not a diatribe against priests, because I said they're busy, busy, busy men. But at some point, priests have to say, forget blacktopping the driveway. Let's forget the toilets in the parish hall. Forget the deficit. My main project is to eliminate the spiritual and intellectual deficit in my parishioners with regard to the challenges we face as Catholics in our culture.
Would it be fair to say, to rephrase what you're saying, we need to focus on spiritual things first? All these other bourgeois concerns will be added unto you after the fact.
Yes.
Or they'll follow.
I agree. Oh, absolutely.
And I think what you're laying out is even the priests are infected by these bourgeois quotidian concerns.
Yes.
And I can see how, if you're looking out at a parish where all your parishioners also seem that way, surely it's scary to challenge them or to ask more of them than just go to your job, give me the money so we can get the new blacktop.
Yeah, and priests do live in fear of their bishops because parishioners don't like to be offended, and they write letters. And if the envelopes dry up, and then all of a sudden you go from being pastor of St. Teresa's in downtown something or other to pastor of a tiny little church in Dog Breath, Nebraska, from where I'm from, and those sorts of things are real, and priests know they're real. Mm-hmm. And so we need bishops, like I said, we need bishops to understand this. And I've talked to so many priests, good men. So it's not just the fact that they lack time to read and so forth. Quite often it is the case that when a priest wants to do something rather provocative and prophetic in his parish, the bishop says, no, you can't do that because you're going to upset people. And that's a huge problem. And that's why I think Laurie is entirely correct. There has to be a certain top-downness here. And it's got to start with the bishops then, in a sense, agreeing with their priests. That the whole clerical culture of a diocese, these people all have to come together and agree upon, what needs to be done.
And so I think all of that, I think, is true. But let me make another argument, which would be, could you not make the argument that we're looking for clerical solutions for what is really a problem of the laity needing to fulfill their universal call to holiness, to sanctify the temporal order, take responsibility for their sphere. And if they weren't so intransigent, maybe the bishops wouldn't be blocking good priests' initiatives to be more radical.
Well, I think obviously now we're talking sort of a sociology of trying to understand the demographics and the intellectual makeup of average Catholic parishioners, say, in the United States.
Sure.
And when you do that, you see that there's the great middle of people that are simply going through the motions. They see some value in going to church, so they go to church, but their understanding of it is not very deep. And I think those Catholics can be led, and I think they can be energized to come out of those doldrums. Now, you're also then going to have agitators on the fringes of both the left and the right in any parish. And I think what bishops have to become more adept at is ignoring those fringes and focusing with a laser, and essentially the fringes will come around too. They need to focus with a laser-like focus, okay, on what it is that the Catholic laity need, rather than what it is that they necessarily in the current moment want. They don't know what they want. They think they know what they want, but they don't really know what the alternatives are. So the church needs to be about the business of presenting those provocative alternatives to them. And my claim, as I said earlier, I think most lay people they don't know what it is they're waiting for, but they're waiting for something. And if something really attractive and provocative is offered, yeah, you're going to get complainers. You're going to get people that are going to walk away and stop sending those envelopes and write letters to the bishops. Fine, let them walk away. And we need then to energize those that remain. But yeah, you're right. In some ways, the laity get the clergy they deserve. Because if you're a lukewarm laity, you're going to get lukewarm clergy. It rubs off. Sure. But that's why you need clergy that have courage and backbone and the courage of their convictions and know what it is that they think, that the people need, not necessarily what they want, but what they need. And now this requires also, and this is key, this requires human tact. It requires a certain human quality. We all know the examples they have a priest that comes into a parish and he's got all kinds of great ideas, but he lacks no human skills. He has no human skills. And so he just comes into a parish, like a bull in a china shop, and in a scorched earth way says, we're getting rid of this and we're getting rid of that. And now we're doing this. Well, then there's a great rebellion, and we know who that, and all of a sudden that priest gets removed. That I remember the late, great Father Lorenzo Albacetti. He was involved in communal liberation. He taught for a while at Dunwoody Seminary, St. Joseph's in Yonkers, New York. He was once asked, what is the number one thing that we should focus on in formating seminarians? And he said, well, first and foremost, we need to focus on making them well-rounded human beings. Because a well-rounded human being then has the tact, has the skill set to come into a parish and develop a vision without trampling on everybody, with knowing how to lead people towards that vision without alienating them. And that's more of an art than a science, which requires, once again, making sure you have the right people in place. And where do you find such men? How do you cultivate such men? That's the great challenge of the church right now, finding men and women, because even though women can't be priests, they can do just about everything else. And Laurie can speak to this as well. The vast majority of volunteers in any church are women. And to a great extent, the church has a problem more with a disaffection of men than with women, as many bishops and priests point out. But anyway, I'm off topic. But anyway, that's my thought on that.
Well, it sounds like, first of all, I was going to make the point that, without that type of leadership, when if you go to church and all you're hearing is kind of just pablum and you walk away and you don't even know what's being said, so you haven't had any sort of direction or inspiration, then other forces that are malign basically step in and they fill that void, because people
Yes.
are going to need some direction. Most people do. In fact, that's not a criticism. Everybody, follows some sort of direction, right?
Yeah,
and
they
so
do.
if you don't have that source, then you're going to have another source, and it's why, it's one of the reasons why we have so much contention and just the culture wars that are going on in our society. But I was also going to say, it sounds to me like some of these quotidian, as Spencer would say, like administrative tasks, need to be taken off of these people so that they have enough time to do their jobs. And so that must be part of the problem as well. That, I know in like Presbyterian churches, there's this, I think they call it the session or something like that. I have no idea why they call it that, but, there's these people that are in charge of the budget, fundraising, making plans for fixing things, all these, the capital campaign, whatever. And so the minister, yes, he's aware of what's going on, but they've taken that on. He does not have to spend all of his time thinking about those things. Seems like maybe priests need something like that, whether it's lay people doing that job or whether it's maybe other employees of the church doing those jobs.
I agree. And to a certain extent, that is happening already in many parishes. But the deeper issue is this: for better or for worse, and I think it's for better, the Catholic Church is a sacramental church oriented around the priesthood. The priesthood is absolutely critical and central to the Catholic Church. We can go a long ways towards being more lay involved and more evangelical and have our structure be the administrative task run by lay people. But the fact is we need more priests. We absolutely need more priests. And the more priests we have, then the less burdensome a lot of these things then become, because there's no substitute for priests in a Catholic Church. You can't have half your parishes in a diocese being priestless, and you can't have priests running like three. I know a priest who's pastor of 3 parishes. You can't have that happen and then expect your priests to have their focus proper and their development be proper. So I think we need to look at very creative ways, not only of increasing the number of priests, but increasing the quality of the men that enter into the priesthood. And by that, I don't mean to disparage the quality of the men that are in the priesthood, but we need more priests who are the creme de la creme of our society. We need more priests that would be top of their class at Harvard Law School, should they go to law school, then become priests, who are priests, those kinds of men. And we're just not. So I think we need to look at very strongly at ways of increasing the number of priests. And I would be therefore open to the idea that we need to allow priests to get married. And that would, I think, increase the pool of candidates. Now, I'm told by many that no, that's not true. You would not increase the pool of available candidates. I think that defies common sense. I think it defies common sense. By the way, and this is way off topic, but it does go to the issue of the numbers of priests. Why is celibacy mandatory? It's mandatory because if it were optional, most priests would not choose it. Now, I think that tells you something. That tells you something about the value of celibacy. Okay? That the majority of priests who become priests remain celibate simply because that's the rule. That's what they're told they have to do. It's not necessarily something they would do if given the choice. And I think they should be given that choice, quite frankly. And I think we would increase the available pool of priests. And I think we would increase the available pool of quality priests, men who would choose this pathway, who are men of great skill, but who choose not to pursue it because they want to get married and have a family. Now, I know that's kind of off topic, but I attend an Anglican ordinariate parish. My pastor has 10 kids. And rather than a detriment to his priesthood, I've never had a better pastor ever in my entire life. And I love his family, and the whole parish does. And they're a blessing. Now, that's not always true, but in this case, it is.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Well, and the other thing in the back of my mind, a memory of listening to Kevin Simmons, the scholar on Fatima.
I've met him. We had he spent a night in my house once.
Oh, nice. Well, he has an argument that one of the other reasons there's a crisis of vocations is everybody's in debt. And that like a standard in a lot of religious orders to join is that you need to not be in debt. And so I think it's one of those intersections where like late capitalist economics is potentially blocking. I don't know. What do you think of that argument?
Well, I think it's true. I'm not an expert in this, so I don't know how male religious orders work. But I've known many, many young women that I taught theology to at DeSales University who decided that they want to test the waters of religious life, only to be told by various female religious communities that they had to dispense with their college debts first. And for some of these kids, their debts were 80 grand and that kind of stuff. So they'd start this fundraiser, GoFundMe pages. But then people become resentful because, all right, they do the GoFundMe thing and they pay off this girl's student loans. And then the girl lasts 6 months in the convent and she leaves and now all of her student loans are paid off. So it comes across sometimes to some people as a kind of scam, but it isn't a scam, but it's a problem. It's a huge problem. Now, do you know, Spencer, I mean, do male religious orders do the same thing with potential candidates? No, I know when I was I was a seminarian for the diocesan priesthood, and the promise that our bishop made to us was you can take out student loans to go to seminary and whatnot. And if you get ordained a priest, the diocese will pay those off. So the diocese was not holding debt over your head. But I do know that female religious orders do. And if maybe male religious like Jesuits or Dominicans, Franciscans, maybe they do as well. I don't know. But it is a problem.
I didn't know about that at all. And that is crazy. I would think that there would be some sort of deal where the church pays off those loans over a period of a few years so that you might
Yeah.
avoid the person who might just sort of stay for 6 months to get their loans paid off. But like, why wouldn't the church itself pay? I don't know. Like, yeah, it's
What if
great.
they don't have the money?
They may or may not have the money. I would hope that they would. They spend money hand over fist for all kinds of other things.
Yeah.
But it would seem to me, to be an incentive. If people want to join religious life but aren't because they have college debts they have to pay off, or other kinds of debts to pay off. I don't know. But the bottom line, though, is you're raising the issue. We have to look at seriously, what are the impediments to people joining religious life? What are those impediments? And what can we do as a church to remove some of those impediments? And it might mean making some painful choices about things like mandatory celibacy for diocesan clergy.
Right. And just to be
go ahead.
Just to be clear real quick, since this isn't like primarily a Catholic podcast, there's no, at least this is my understanding, it's just like within the Roman Rite, within the Latin Church, there's a rule that priests have to be celibate, but that's not some like God told us that was the case.
Right.
So those rules can be changed, correct?
Yes. There's a distinction we make in theology between doctrines and disciplines. A doctrine, like, Christ is both human and divine, God is three persons in one God, those cannot change. Those are set in stone. But a discipline is just a practice that the church has adopted that isn't mandated by God. It's not mandated by Christ. In fact, when Christ is talking about celibates for the kingdom of God, he says, let those who choose it can. He doesn't impose it. And St. Paul says, well, I wish that everybody could be, without a wife and family as I am. But St. Paul doesn't then say, well, I'm going to impose that. If you're going to be a fellow worker with me in the vineyard, you have to be celibate. He doesn't impose it. And the church could change that. The Pope could, with a stroke of a pen tomorrow, could change that and say, no, priests can now get married. And personally, I have reached the conviction that we should allow priests to get married. Now, people disagree with that. That's controversial, but that's my view. And I think that we would increase the number of priests in our church, which I think is a dire need right now, and the quality of priests as well.
I've heard it described as like joining the army too, that basically when you choose to be a priest, now pretty much all control is lost. They can send you wherever they want. That's a huge sacrifice as well. That's very, very scary. And I'm sure that a number of people have stepped away just because of that,
Well, yeah. And personally, I have another issue with that in the sense that I think, and once again, this is controversial and different good people have different opinions, but I happen to think that the Catholic Church moves its priests around from parish to parish too often. You get these itinerant, rootless priests who stay in one parish 5 years, and then they're off to another parish for 5 years, and off to another parish for 5 years. Just when you are starting to sink your teeth into your parish and make headway, make traction, the new priest assignments come out, and you're now at St. Fidgetus, and there you go, you're done here, and I think that's a problem.
Yeah. Well, it seems to me like it further disincentivizes hatching long-term plans, making deeper connections, having this vision. Yeah,
I think so. Now, some pastors do stay forever in whatever parish they're in. But I think that's not the norm these days. Too many priests moving around. So if priests were married and had a family and so forth, I don't think the church would be able to do that and not violate, the integrity of that priest's family in some ways.
Good point.
Like, for example, in my ordinariate parish, like I said, my pastor has 10 kids. The bishop of the ordinariate in the United States, Bishop Stephen Lopes, who's stationed in Houston, has told our pastor here, you're there for as long as you need to be there. I'm not going to move you because you've got a family, you've got a parish, you're doing good work there. You're going to stay there. Trust me, I'm not going to move you. And I think we need more of that, whether the priest has a family or not.
Yeah. I agree. I would assume that it would be a lot easier for a priest to lead in the building of community if he himself was a long-lasting part of a community and had built up relationships with people.
Yeah, that's so true. I mean, I wrote a blog post called, on celibacy, the legacy of Damien Alfonso Bergman. My pastor's name is Father Bergman, and his wife lost a child in utero, a version of trisomy disease. And one of the criticisms, of course, of married clergy is that a priest is going to have a split focus, that his focus will be on his family and not on the parish, and that his duties will then be too much for him, and so on. And it is true. Father Bergman was in many ways incapacitated as an active priest in our parish for a while when his family was dealing with this loss. I mean, he still said mass and so forth, but he just wasn't as present as he could be for several months. But here's what happened. I point out in the blog post, the parish rallied around him. It became an opportunity for the parish to love their pastor even more, and to love his family even more, and for him to love them back. Because the families in the parish recognized the family crisis he was going through, and we had a powerful empathy with it. And we all cooked, we did a meal train for his family, and we cleaned the rectory for his family, and we ran errands for his family. And then eventually Father Bergman, got back into active. And so rather than seeing his married priesthood and his children as a split focus, I saw it as a charism, a gift to our church to love and to rally. And I just think that this is a wrong-headed way to approach it, to think of it in these purely practical categories. Well, if he's got so many kids, he can't do the parish. Hogwash.
No, it's the difference between Plato and Aristotle, right? Aristotle
Yeah.
basically said you have to be integrated, and it was property argument, but that you need to be integrated with the community, and even own your own personal property in order to take full interest in that community. Whereas Plato said, the ideal was perfect communism and a lack of relationships. So the Aristotelian position has always made more sense to me.
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah.
filtering
Yeah.
what you're saying through that basic lens, that, when you have a family and you have, I haven't given this a whole lot of thought, because I am kind of like, I've always admired people who could make this sort of ultimate sacrifice of celibacy. It's like more than most people could ever do, but I'm open to what you're saying, because I do recognize that it can deepen relationships, make people more stable. It doesn't have to draw people away, or make them look at this as just a job. I don't think. A lot of priests and ministers look at their. It depends on the individual, but look at their position as just a job. I don't think that.
And in a strange kind of way, I also think that, and I'll bring it back to Dorothy in a second, Dorothy Day. I think that actually allowing for a married clergy, at least for diocesan clergy, not necessarily religious orders, would only, in many ways, increase the value of celibacy and the respect we would have celibacy, because we would then recognize that priests that do choose celibacy for the sake of the kingdom of God are making a real choice. It's not something that has been forced upon them. They are making and embracing a real choice. And I think that would only increase, as you said, our respect for the heroic sacrifice that is involved, that these men are then making. I don't see it as a zero-sum game. It's not an either or. I think that having a celibate clergy helps us understand the value of married clergy, and vice versa. So anyway, that's but to bring it back to Dorothy, I think this really isn't all off topic, because to go back to what we said about Dorothy Day's personalism and communitarianism, I think that Dorothy would say that what we need today in our Catholic parishes are the development of a true community life in those parishes, not some perfunctory sacramental life where people drive in at the last second, get their communion, leave, and drive away, and that's it. But a real community of people, and that anyway, anything that would increase the building of those deep communal structures in a parish, she would be in favor of. And maybe she never really spoke a great deal about it, but maybe a married clergy would be one of those community building little bricks that could be thrown. Now, I could be completely wrong about this, but people say that I am. People say I'm wrong about a lot of things.
That's worth thinking about for sure.
But in other words, I think that it's all part and parcel of Dorothy Day's Catholic worker vision of the church as a family, as the church as a community, a true community of charity, of love, of dispossession of self, of the giving away of self to others. And anything that creates that in a parish is creating Christ-like cruciform existence. And she would be therefore in favor of more of any sort of emphasis that increase that, any sort of strategy, if you will, that emphasize that.
Yeah, and I think that's what's attracted us first to Peter Maurin's vision for what the Catholic worker should be, and then also through Communio, and what really comes to mind is DC Schindler's, like how he's laid out in his books, like the Catholicity of reason. How do we integrate everything together instead of everything's just atomized and disparate?
Yeah. DC Schindler is David L. Schindler's son. David L. Schindler passed away a couple of weeks ago, and David Christopher Schindler, his son, is now at the JP2 Institute in Washington, is heavily involved in the journal Communio in Washington. Those two things are kind of linked, and he's a genius. We call him Little Dave, as distinct with Big Dave, his dad. He is an absolute philosophical genius. I think he's the greatest living Catholic philosopher in the English-speaking world. And you're absolutely correct. You know, his vision of reason is very Catholic, expansive, integrating, and that's what we need.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's where. So the level where I'm dissatisfied with the state of the Catholic worker movement is I don't feel like we're providing the groundwork for anything like that. Not to say it's all on the Catholic worker, but this vision of life from the family to the parish to the international level and everything integrated, a loving communio. I don't know. What do you have to say?
Well, no, I agree. I mean, I'm hesitant to be critical of the Catholic worker movement, but it's hard not to be with regard to some things, because I think there was a period of time, still exists a little bit, but it was really more in the 70s through maybe about 10 or 15 years ago, where I think the Catholic worker movement, and this is a broad generality, there were exceptions here and there, but I think the Catholic worker movement in general had lost the spiritual Catholic dimension of Dorothy Day and Peter Maurin, and had simply become political activists for various essentially left-wing political causes. You talk about somebody being late. Oftentimes I'll speak to fairly conservative Catholic groups, and I'll talk about the need to ensconce Dorothy Day's vision and things. And they'll say, well, wait a minute, Dorothy Day, Catholic worker, isn't that a bunch of far left-wing communist liberal types out there, you know? And I have to say, well, but that's the image that the movement got, because it got mired in essentially leftist political activism. And some of their causes, of course, were great. But I mean, and I knew Catholic worker houses where if you tried to, and Dorothy met this in her own lifetime, if you tried to introduce very specifically Catholic sort of elements like praying the Liturgy of the Hours or going on a retreat a Catholic retreat once a month, they would rebel. And half of them don't even believe in Catholicism and just see it as an annoyance to be gotten around. Thankfully, I think that's changing. There, you see little pockets of people. I know tons of them now, mainly young people, young Catholics who were inspired by Dorothy Day and Peter Maurin, who are starting Catholic worker houses and Catholic worker farms that really are truly Catholic in that integrating sense that you pointed out with regard to DC Schindler. And so there is hope, I think, for the future of the Catholic worker movement in those people. But I think those worker houses that have simply devolved into leftist politics and agitation in that regard, I think they're doomed for destruction. I don't think they have a future.
I think so. Because at that point, why are you a Catholic worker?
Exactly. Why don't you just go and join some other activist organization that doesn't have Catholic in the title? So I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I don't move around in a lot of different Catholic worker houses and stuff. My impressions are subjective and anecdotal, but I do know certain Catholic workers that have been drummed out of whatever Catholic worker house they were in, persecuted because they were Catholics, and held to Catholic beliefs and things. And it's a sad phenomenon, but it's real, and I can attest to the fact that it's real. That's not merely an impression from a distance. I know Catholic workers that have been kicked out of Catholic or hounded out of Catholic worker houses because they were, and when I say they're Catholic, I don't mean MAGA hat wearing right-wing conspiracy nutjob Catholics. I mean just Dorothy Day style Catholics.
Sure.
All right. And I don't know.
Sure.
I know that we know Dorothy Day's granddaughter, Martha Hennessy, and she shares some of these concerns too.
Yeah. We went up a couple months ago to Chicago and saw a talk from her. Yeah,
she's great. She's a wonderful woman. She's been to our farm a few times, and my wife knows her better than I do. But yeah, she lives and moves in those circles, and she has these sort of same concerns about Catholic identity. But she's a very soft-spoken woman, and so she's not going to agitate in certain ways.
Sure. Nor do I think it would necessarily be all that helpful anyway.
No, it wouldn't be. It would simply be alienating.
And I think there is an argument to be made that like the intersection of whatever remnants of Catholicism still there with like rad liberalism that can bring some people into the church.
Oh yeah. And a lot of the things that the radical liberals stand for would be things that I would agree with most wholeheartedly. But yeah, there's something to be said for bringing them into the fold slowly. But the point would be there has to be a critical mass of Catholics in a Catholic worker house. You can have all kinds of people in a Catholic worker. I'm not arguing for uniformity. They all have to be ich werde bei Gott sort of goose-stepping Catholics. They have to be that. And there's a big tent, and you can have a kaleidoscope of all kinds of different Catholics. But you better have a critical mass of, just sort of Catholics, Dorothy Day style Catholics in a Catholic worker house. Otherwise, it's just going to fly apart and not stand for very much.
Hopefully. And go ahead, Laurie.
No, not decent advice, I was going to say. And I have a question I want to ask for sure. So don't let us end with, I have a theological question, but I will defer until Spencer.
No, go ahead.
Are you sure? Well, so, I have been a Catholic for 20 years, but I am fairly influenced by Protestant theology. I picked up Jürgen Moltmann's book, The Crucified God, a while back.
I know it well.
Yeah, I think maybe Spencer actually sent it to me or told me about it. And it really transformed my way of thinking about Christ and specifically the crucifixion. Also, I've been influenced by Brian Zond, who is very, much in that mold of his view of rejecting substitutionary atonement as the main, explanation for the meaning of the crucifixion, and the idea of the co-suffering God, solidarity with human suffering. So I was just wondering, to get back to ressourcement theology, because I'm just beginning to learn about that. I just subscribed to Communio. Could you kind of explain, relative to that position, the sort of Moltmannian position about who God is compared to ressourcement?
First, I studied Moltmann when I was doing doctoral studies at Fordham in the early 90s. And I know that book well, in particular. And I admire Moltmann. In particular, I admire his Christocentric focus on the cross, and on that the cross marks everything that we should do in Christology. The guy I wrote my dissertation on The ressourcement Catholic thinker Hans Urs von Balthasar was in dialogue with Moltmann. And Balthasar agreed that the cruciformity is the defining characteristic of Christ's existence and therefore of our own. And that if we want to know who God is, we need to look to the cross, the co-suffering God, the God who comes to us and breaks himself open for us. All of that is deeply. I read Moltmann and was, oftentimes moved to tears by his reflections on the significance of the God who is implicated in our time in history. That being said, I would say Balthasar's critique, the ressourcement critique of Moltmann, and my own, would be that Moltmann involves God a bit too much in history. In fact, God becomes, if you know anything about the philosophy of Hegel, all right, God, in a sense, comes to himself through history. And there's way too much of what we would call process theology in Moltmann, where God changes as the world changes, and God evolves through the world and in the world's experience. And that's kind of what Moltmann means by co-suffering, not just that the infinite, good, almighty God has entered into our time and history and shares our suffering, but in a sense, God is also suffering and changing with time and history. And there's a problem with that, I think, theologically speaking, because it compromises the infinity of God, I think. It compromises the distinction between God and creation, I think, a little too much. I think that's a distinction that we have to maintain. And I think that would be the ressourcement critique of Moltmann. It's too Hegelian, too involving of God in time and history. The trick in interpreting the incarnation, where the human and the divine come together in a theandric union, as the Council of Chalcedon points out, which Moltmann sort of rejects, you have to maintain the unity of the two natures, but in such a way that the two natures are not necessarily compromised. The human remains human and the divine remains divine, and that Christ doesn't become a tertium quid, a third thing, a hybrid, a God-human hybrid or something like that. And so the ressourcement guys would say, no, you have to stick with a Chalcedonian or a Neo-Chalcedonian view. Maximus the Confessor and these guys, I'm getting too technical, I know, but it's necessary in order to answer these questions. God is implicated in our time and history, but is not subsumed by it, not consumed by it, which, if you follow the logic of Moltmann's position to its end, God becomes subsumed by and consumed by history. And which is why some people go a step further than Moltmann into death of God theology. But anyway, that's anyway.
Yeah, I can see that. So kind of in a nutshell, you read Moltmann as presenting a mutable God.
Yes, right? You just encapsulated in 3 seconds.
Yeah, and
better than I did in 5 minutes. So thank you. Yeah, Moltmann's God is mutable and not immutable. But you know what? But this is the value though of Moltmann. So I don't just dismiss all that heretic. No, there's value here, because in my guy Hans Urs von Balthasar, we have to rethink what God's immutability means, though. I mean, for too long we viewed God's immutability in these hyper-Greek metaphysical categories as this unchanging, distant, monolithic thing that is, in a sense, completely unaffected by the world. And that is not a properly Christian understanding of the divine immutability. We have to find a way to rethink immutability in such a way that it can incorporate into itself the world's mutability in a true existential way, while God still remaining God and God still remaining immutable. And that's, Balthasar does this, Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict does this to an extent, but that's a very thorny theological question, God-world relation. So I'm not just going to say, oh, Moltmann's all wrong, don't read him. Read him. I think he's really, I'm glad you've read him. He's a very fruitful thinker. I just don't completely agree with him. So what? So I have problems with it. Still, I think it's a great value to read him.
And how do you bring that thought to bear on the questions of penal substitutionary atonement?
I would recommend a great book by a friend of mine, Margaret Turek. She teaches theology at St. Patrick's Seminary in Menlo Park, California, near San Francisco. She's just written a book published by Ignatius Press on the atonement, where she goes through the various theories. And she points out, and I think correctly, and she's following Balthasar here once again, that yes, the standard ways of envisioning substitutionary atonement and penal substitution are deeply problematic and have been rightly criticized. Nevertheless, some version of atonement theology runs throughout the New Testament. You can't simply throw atonement theology out the window and remain faithful to the scriptures, because the atonement language is throughout the New Testament. So the penal substitution idea is in many ways bestial. The way it's traditionally sort of put forward is, we sinned, God's pissed off. Now an innocent man got himself butchered and God's happy. Yeah, because that innocent man and getting butchered somehow substituted for us, and God poured out all of his hateful wrath on the sinfulness of humanity on his son dying on a cross. And now he can be happy towards us and have goodwill towards us because he got his pound of flesh. And so it's a very bloodthirsty, mean-spirited, horrible vision of God to view the atonement in that fashion. But nevertheless, there is a great truth in the idea that sin introduces a disequilibrium into things. Sin makes us off kilter. And in order to redeem us, to recover the equilibrium, to put us back on kilter, if that's a word. All right. God could have simply waved a magic wand and said, oh, as we say in golf, that's a mulligan. That's a do-over. Forget it. Forget about it. You guys are human. You're going to make mistakes. I'm not too concerned about it. That's not the way God chose to do it, because that wouldn't respect our freedom. God chose to redeem, and you guys both know this. I mean, God chose to redeem us from within by reordering the existential categories of human existence that have been disfigured by sin. And in order to do that, God had to become a human being. This is very Anselmian, cur deus homo. Why did God have to become a human being? God had to, in order to heal our humanity, to enter into it and to heal us from within, to reorder the structures of human existence from within. But our sinful actions do, in order to reorder them, those sinful actions do require that we, in a sense, make restitution for what we've done wrong. So C.S. Lewis, for example, says Christ is the perfect penitent, or he offers that perfect restitution for us, and we have to affix ourselves to that somehow. There's all kinds of different theories of the atonement. Balthasar says there's 5 or 6 standard ones, none of which we can reduce the New Testament to, and all of which we have to sort of hold in tension with one another. But the one thing that Margaret Turek, Balthasar, and a lot of us have in common is the utter rejection of this more bestial concept, which you see more in Protestant circles than in Catholic, I think, where God pours out his wrath on the Son, and now he doesn't have to be angry at sin anymore. I know that's not a real satisfactory answer, but it's a deeply complicated theological question. So I'll just leave it at that. The more vulgar concept of penal substitution is clearly wrong.
Thanks. I appreciate that. I think that the vulgar notion of it has alienated many Christians, right? Many people have walked away from Christianity because of it. So it's important to try to think it through, even though, like, as you're implying here, to a certain extent, there remains a mystery, and it's okay to kind of accept that as well. But
another thing that's a big turnoff that's often associated with penal substitution theories is the massa damnata approach to salvation. Massa damnata is Latin, which means that the great mass of human beings are going to be damned, that more people are going to hell than who are saved. And that's because the vast majority of people never really appropriate to themselves the salvation that comes from Christ via this penal substitution, and therefore God remains angry at them. God is still going to pour out his wrath on them. And I don't know. I think that's also, I know it's a somewhat related, not completely related issue, but I think those two vulgar preoccupations of certain traditional Christians and Catholics, penal substitution and that most people are going to hell, are huge turnoffs. I think it's one of the primary obstacles to people becoming Christians, because it makes the entire Christian evangel, it changes it from an evangel of joy and liberation to an evangel of anger and punishment and punitiveness. It turns religion into a game. did you check the right box in the religion questionnaire? And if you didn't, off to hell with you. This is simply silly.
And the rest of the way we live our lives doesn't matter.
Yeah, exactly. You just check the right religion box. Remember, I'm not a huge fan of the little cartoon South Park, but I remember watching a South Park episode where, if your viewers know South Park, one of the lead characters is this little cartoon kid named Cartman, and he and his buddies end up in hell. I don't remember how, but they're in hell, and they're angry, and so they demand, "Why are we in hell, damn it?" And sort of God's spokesman comes out on hell's stage, and he's got a little clipboard. He says, "Well, Mormonism was the right answer. Sorry, Mormonism was the right answer." And
aren't Hitler and Gandhi right next to each other or something?
Yeah. So it's that sort of South Park view of checking the right religion box that I think is so a predominant attitude that a lot of people have about what it is that the Catholic Church teaches about salvation. You have to be Catholic or you're going to go to hell, or some association with the Catholic Church, you're going to hell. I think all of these things are tied together. Penal substitution, massa damnata, salvation is essentially checking the right boxes in the religion questionnaire. These are massively horrible ways of approaching things, I think, that turn millions of people away from the faith.
They do. And for those who stay, they deviate their focus into getting that box checked instead of thinking about how they might live their lives in a more interesting, creative, joyful, and faithful way.
Well, and this goes right back to the beginning of our conversation, doesn't it? I mean, Dorothy Day and the Catholic Worker Movement and other people who think like this is one of their points. If our average parish, all right, is simply going to have its focus be on this sort of narrow vision of religion, that we're just here. I'm here on Sunday just so I can check the religion box and say, okay, it's a sort of Pascalian wager here. I'm coming to church hedging my bets, and it's good for the kids and so on. This is a largely contractual and forensic understanding of the faith, and it's going to die unless the faith becomes evangelical, existentially provocative, and that's only going to happen. It's only going to happen when laity and clergy alike get on fire for Christ, get on fire for the faith, get on, and not in some sort of crazy televangelist way, but in terms of building the structures of human solidarity in Christ on a very local level. That's key. It's absolutely key. It's the only way forward.
Yeah, and a little while ago you brought up the word liberation. Can you, flowing off of that, can you define what Catholic social teaching defines as integral liberation?
Well, it would be multi-layered, obviously, but it would begin with the spiritual. When the New Testament speaks of Christ liberating us, the thought world of the Mediterranean basin in which St. Paul and Peter and everybody moved when they moved out into the world was that largely the world is ordered and dominated by what they call principalities and powers. This is what Paul means when he says that Christ has vanquished the principalities and powers. And by that, he didn't simply mean the imperium, Rome. They meant the sort of heavenly, or the sort of gods and spirits that dominate our lives and hold us in chains. We need to understand that the average pagan of that time, they didn't have the same relationship with a loving God that sort of Christians had. I mean, their attitude towards the gods was largely contractual and manipulative. We're just going to do certain rituals and things to bend to the gods to our will. Otherwise, we fear the gods. The gods are to be feared as capricious and arbitrary and can be quite nasty. All right. And so people lived in fear of these sorts of intermediary spirits that dominated everything. And when Christianity moves into the Mediterranean world, it was a message. The gospel was good news because it was a message that these enslaving spirits that hold us in these chains, hold us in the chains of fate and domination, are broken by Christ. Christ smashes that entire intermediary world and conquers it. And now we simply need to live the resurrection and ascended life of Christ, and we can be liberated from those bonds. Now that then trickles down into, we are also then liberated from the more proximate enslavers of the political and economic domain, the rich. the military people, the political people, everyone that holds us in chains, whose authority had been tied to those principalities and powers. You destroy those principalities and powers, then you destroy the divine mandate of Caesar and every spiritual mandate that descended from Caesar into the landed aristocracy and the military classes. So there was also a powerful egalitarian message of political liberation that the church had to mute for a while, otherwise they'd get their necks chopped off. I mean, it's one of the reasons why the empire persecuted Christians off and on, was because the claim Jesus is Lord implies Caesar is not. And that was seen as having direct political implications. And I'll translate that into our own time, and to give liberation theologians their due, although I have problems with their very worldly focus on simply economics. The fact is that and this is Dorothy Day, our spiritual liberation in Christ cannot then simply be seen as checking the religion box. I've got the sacraments. It's a me and Jesus. My rear end is greased for heaven. I'm going to ride the Jesus magic carpet into heaven. No, your focus then immediately turns to the liberating aspects of that message for the world in which you live. And that if the principalities and powers have been vanquished in our time, that means too that the political and military and economic entities that dominate our culture and live within the ethos of these unchristian spirits, whether they exist or not, within that ethos, that too has been broken. And the same as then as now, the affirmation that Christ is Lord is also to say that the President of the United States is not. And that has direct political and economic implications in terms of what kinds of social justice we should be fighting for.
And can you lay out just real quick what distinguishes the integral liberation you're calling for a more standard left liberal style of liberation?
Well, because first and foremost, the kind of liberation that Dorothy Day spoke of, and I'm speaking of, and the Communio guys would speak of, is a first and foremost a spiritual liberation. Because you cannot be liberated economically and politically if you are internally enslaved to ongoing structures of sin in your own life. And so it does begin with conversion, with metanoia, with repentance of your own sins and liberation from those things. But then you're right, it's an integral liberation, because I cannot repent of my own personal sins unless I also at the same time acknowledge the manner in which those sins are created by and implicated in the broader social sins, in structural sins of our society. And thus say, therefore, to properly repent of my own uncharity towards my neighbor and my acts of selfishness, to properly repent of that spiritually means practically that I have to agitate for, charity on a social scale, and to have charity then ensconced in the political, economic, and military order. That I can't simply be content to have charity towards the people I meet at the grocery store or my own family. I have to also then translate that into a more global perspective of things, and how my own sins are implicated in that broader structure. It's deeply, deeply problematic when Christians individualize their sins in this fashion and don't see their full integral human implications. So we should be fighting for, I think in particular, political and economic justice. And I think concretely, economic justice. And today, that doesn't just mean the divide between rich and poor. It doesn't just mean living wage and fighting for workers and labor rights and those kinds of things. In this way, we differ from lefties. Those are important things, but leftists tend to focus on those structural things. We also need to focus on the extent to which our economy has now morphed into what Susanna Zuboff has called surveillance capitalism, and the deep, deep, deep connections between corporate, big tech America, government, and our own consumerism. And that we are, insofar as we remain within this consumerist motif, we are contributing to a deep form of economic tyranny in our lives that's only going to increase over time. in the surveillance capitalist state and the collusion of big tech, government, corporate America, and so on. So it's not just about poverty, it's also about the way in which our economics is now forming our cultural matrix and therefore our spiritual lives as well.
Mhm. Which leads into, I mean, I think one of the main contributions Laurie and I are trying to bring to the world and to the Catholic worker is a more refined reading of Marxist economics, where we see that the logic of capitalism is a major problem. And capitalism is not business, markets, private ownership. That has been like in the wider like atheistic philosophy and in like the political practice of it. That all, like in the interest of being Catholic, that stuff has to be rejected or at least nuanced. But the insight that there's a logic of constant growth, of reducing everybody to economic actors that get manipulated and moved around, we need to see that as an obstacle to that integral liberation, I think. Would you add anything to that, Laurie?
Oh yeah, I agree. I agree completely. And the Marxist economic analysis is obviously complex, and obviously I agree with large sections of Marx's critique of capitalism. I'm a complete opponent of capitalism in its modern iteration. I mean, I believe in free markets, but that's a very generic one.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Where do those exist?
Yeah, free markets should exist, whatever that means.
Mhm.
But capitalism, as the commodification of everything, that's the problem. Everything is reduced to an economic calculus. And in that regard, Marx is often accused of doing the same thing, of reducing everything to an economic calculus, and to a certain extent he is. But he was responding at the same time to that phenomena within capitalist society. The thing that Marx did not foresee, I mean, he foresaw that eventually the proletarian masses were simply, I mean, he was living in the age of the high age of factory industrial capitalism, and no labor unions, no labor laws, and the great oppressed masses. There were no child labor laws, and so on. That was his reality. He saw that as intolerable, that eventually these great proletarian masses would rise up in class warfare and overthrow their capitalist overlords. What he didn't foresee was the rise of bourgeois consumerism and the welfare state, and labor unions. He didn't foresee the manner in which liberal political democracy in collusion with capitalism would ameliorate some of those problems with the working classes by distributing wealth more generously, by creating welfare state policies like national health care systems, by invoking child labor laws, by encouraging labor unions, and all of that taken together created what the Russian philosopher theologian Berdyaev called the bourgeois cult of well-being, and so that now what you see especially in 20th century Western capitalist countries, is the triumph of a certain materialistic view of life, where the ultimate goal of life is simply material well-being and the pursuit of consumeristic happiness. See, Karl Marx did not envision that happening, and so his revolution never happened. But his critique of capitalism, I think, remains very powerful, very cogent.
Yeah, and I'm postulating it still stands, that because we have confronted this fundamental contradiction, we've expanded out. Now we're sucking resources from all over the world and we're moving it around. But it's an unstable basis.
Yes,
for our society.
No, I agree, and I should have made that clear. I mean, when in talking about what Marx did not foresee, which was the rise of bourgeois consumerism and the cult of material well-being and the distribution of wealth and so on, it doesn't. In some ways, all of that is simply kick the can down the road. And you're correct to point out that the great economic largesse that Americans in particular enjoy, that has made the rise of this bourgeois cult of well-being possible, is built on the back of economic exploitation of other less fortunate countries. and oftentimes the use of military power to make sure that that exploitation continues. Especially, you see that in places like Central America, where every time people rose up to create a more democratic polity where economics would be more to their benefit, America would fund subversive political coup d'etats and so forth to ensconce their dictator in power, and so on, through CIA operatives and that kind of thing. Yeah. In that sense, Marxist critique,
branding it as anti-communist action.
Oh yeah, yeah. You're fighting the Marxists, and the Marxism then becomes this great boogeyman that justifies any CIA operation, any oppressive military intervention of any kind by the United States, because we can't have them there Marxists down there in Nicaragua, for crying out loud, or El Salvador. So we need to run around cutting the tongues out of Catholic catechists in small villages, talking to campesinos about God and Christ and liberation. We can't have that. So Reagan funded the Contras and so on to go and butcher people in this great anti-communist crusade. And yet the fact of the matter is that the Marxist critique of capitalist structures was still very much operative in the minds of many people in those countries, because the dynamic that Marx was describing was still real in those countries, was still reigning in those countries, and therefore gives us a kind of window into the fact that capitalism in the form that Marx criticized it is still very much alive and still very real, even if some of its worst effects in first world countries have been ameliorated. Yeah, so Marx is still, yeah, I think Marx is still very significant. And I have a lot of friends who put a priest friend of mine, Father Mike Kerper, up in New Hampshire, an old seminary classmate, is a big fan of Karl Marx's critique of capitalism.
Marxism helps explain why we can't easily get off this treadmill at this point, right? That it's not a matter of just individual choices, and it would take a huge amount of political action. I mean, yeah. We've talked to people who basically said there's no way this can change unless we have some sort of environmental collapse or some sort of major upheaval, because the whole system is sort of self-moving at this point and so tied up with major sources of economic and political power that it just, and I think this creates a great deal of anxiety in people. My own personal theory is that this is why we're having such disruptions in both the way that we do business, the church, also, the government, obviously politics, is that everybody feels as though they cannot do anything but what they're doing. I have to have this job. I must, I don't really have the choice to do what I want to with my life. I have to work 40 to 60 hours a week. So does my wife. So does my, my whole family or whatever. That was put wrongly, but anyway. But
I agree.
Yeah. So it feels like slavery, even if you're making a good living. And anyway.
That's what I said before, like an hour ago. People are still miserable and unhappy, and they don't know why. Well, this is why. My fear, though, is this, to borrow Spencer's phrase, what keeps me awake at night, is that in most instances of societal collapse that we see in history, and a lot of times those societal collapses do happen because of environmental disasters, and we might be on the brink of a major environmental disaster. All too often, though, when societies collapse, they're not replaced by something better. They're replaced by something more fascistic, more despotic, more totalitarian, because as Dostoevsky pointed out a long time ago, if you're given the choice between chaos and order, human beings will choose order over chaos any day of the week. And therefore, we will turn to any populist demagogue who promises that to us, promises us our bread and circuses. And when you combine that with the exponentially increasing power of the surveillance state and surveillance big tech capitalism, cameras everywhere, face recognition software everywhere, everything on a digital chip, everything about me economically, personally, politically is codified and stored someplace by somebody. Every single cell phone call we make is intercepted by somebody at the NSA. going through a massive artificial intelligent computer, sifting through, looking for code words. They do. Every single cell phone call we make is intercepted by somebody and sifted through an algorithm. This is only going, that noose is only going to continue tighten around us as we go through the 21st century. And my fear is that with societal collapse, people will willingly give up their freedoms to this leviathan of technocracy. Mm-hmm. And that will then become the sort of new tyranny in many, many ways. But the sad thing though is, Laurie, I agree with you. Something big has to happen in order to shake people out of their complacency. But we better be careful what we wish for and be prepared in the midst of societal collapse for also all kinds of things that we wouldn't like.
And then if those times ever come, I guess it's more incumbent upon us than ever to be virtuous and I don't know, able to take care of people, at least in our immediate environment.
Yes. I think the deal is this. No matter what the outward societal situation, whether it's going to be a collapse or we're simply going to morph into a technocratic dystopia, whatever it is, the only solution to any of this is going to be a spiritual one, a Christological one. And so we have to simply attend to what's right in front of us at the moment. We simply have to attend to being the most faithful followers of Christ that we can possibly be, the most faithful imitators of Christ that we can possibly be. That's what we can control. That's what's in our grasp. And we can worry all day long about what is maybe coming or not coming. But we have to be the keepers of the flame. If we're going to see society collapse around us and everything around us is simply a barbarian rabble, we have to keep that flame going so that eventually it can combust again into something that will be society forming in a way that we can't even envision it would be right now.
I guess in a way that's what we're trying to do, right, Spencer?
Yes.
In our own little way.
That's it. That's all.
What else can you do?
Yeah. That's all we can do. See, one of the problems, as D.C. Schindler points out, one of the problems with modern political liberalism is that it actually is so hegemonically pervasive that it robs us of the imaginative capacity to even think of how things might be different. All too often, people come to people like you and I and Spencer and say, all right, Mr. Smarty Pants, and you're so critical of this, that, and what's your solution? And well, other than Christ and the theological gobbledygook that I toss out, what they're saying is, what is your practical, prudential, political solution in a post-liberal order? Well, I have no idea. I have no idea what a post-liberal political operation in a sort of Christological register, what that would look like. I have no idea, because modernity has robbed me of the imaginative capacity to imagine anything different than what we have now. So it's going to have to be something that grows organically out of the rubble of what came before. And I think we're going to be surprised and shocked at whatever imaginative solutions come up after the collapse, if you want to put it that way, so that it'll be unique. It'll be its own historical manifestation of something Christian and new. And we simply really don't know yet what that might even look like. That's my view.
And all we can do is put one foot in front of the other, do our best to network.
That's right.
And do our best to be ready.
And to not despair. Things are not hopeless. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of sap in the tree still. All right. Christ is real. Holy Spirit's real. God's real. The gospel is true, as Julian of Norwich said, fear not, all manner of things will be well. And,
and to end with that, I've at least in my own life, I can attest to, I've absorbed this kind of liberal super ego that I have to be responsible for everything. And part of that, I think there is a truth that we should strive to do everything we can to be responsible for ourselves, for our brothers, for the world. But I think, at least in my own life, I've taken that to an extreme where I've lost sight of I'm a little creature, there's a wider creation, and there's a creator, And ultimately, it's not on me to figure all this out.
That's right. What's on you is to live where you are, according to the Christological principles of a cruciform imitative existence, where we're imitating Christ to the best that we can. That's what we're supposed to do. Now that has political implications. I mean, each one of us has to be involved in the political process. It does. I'm not at all saying, oh, forget politics. It doesn't matter. It matters greatly.
Right.
And we should agitate for certain sound and good political changes in our culture, because it may not collapse and things may not enter into surveillance capitalism, and it may not be doomsday. There might be a tipping point, a turning point before we reach catastrophe, where people come to their senses. And that's what we need to pray for and hope for. People are not evil. Most people are fundamentally decent and good people. And I have a deep, deep faith in that reservoir of goodness in almost every human being that I meet. And so I'm actually hopeful. Yeah, there's maybe potential catastrophe all around us. But I love people, and I think people are great. And I think people have a great capacity for goodness. And we need to be able to image Christ in a way that provokes people into tapping into that goodness in ways that I think they really want to.
Well, and I feel like you've done that with us today in this interview.
Well, thank you. It was a great conversation. I love talking to you guys.
Yeah, I was going to say, I can't follow what you guys just said in the last 5 minutes with anything more appropriate than that. So I was like, I'm shutting up.
Well, I should probably shut up more too, but I've kissed the Blarney Stone and I could talk some talk. So thanks for having me on to talk my talk.